Good morning, Mark Schmitt. How was your hurricane?
My hurricane was fine. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm
That's
Mark
right.
Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute,
Which is? Tell us.
which is a progressive think tank based in New York, Hyde Park, New York City, Hyde Park, New York, where the Roosevelt Library is, and basically me in Washington.
And that is the F.D. Roosevelt, not the T.R.
Exactly. F and E, but not
Yeah.
T.
I am Matt Welch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, your long-standing magazine of free minds and free markets. I'm also co-author with Nick Gillespie of the Declaration of Independence with a TS, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America.
Which I've read some of and will finish and recommend.
Hey, it's nice of you. What did you hate about it, and what did you like about it so far?
I'm really intrigued by it. I really like. I have to say, you pick up a book like that, and we should get on to our main topics. But
Sure.
you expect the usual beyond left and right stuff, and what I like about you guys, and it's generally true. It's one of the appealing things about libertarians is your scope is not just political. So for you, the value of getting beyond the left-right impasse and some of the is really to create more space for non-political life, for the things that for music and whatever it motivates people. And I think it's very rare to see political writing that appreciates the value of those other things, in life. It's actually it kind of you'll hate this, but it kind of reminds me of my favorite of essay of Keynes is the one called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he talks about the possibility of a world that's which there's such relative prosperity that the kind of grinding economic pressures that were part of daily life. Even I guess that was probably written after the war, maybe before. I'm not sure. Are lifted, and there's more. That there's more freedom for people to fulfill their potential as human beings, and that's kind of my favorite part of it. It's fun to see the surprising aspects of it, like the long chapter on the Velvet Underground is great, and kind of reinforces that sense that there's more to life than politics.
It's funny. The Velvet Underground had a role, as we discussed in the book, of toppling communism in Czechoslovakia.
It did have a political role, no question about it.
Which was unintended by the authors of the music, which is one of the beautiful things about it all. But I'm influenced by the fact that I lived there in the 1990s, and you would get these articles about former dissident playwrights or novelists or whatever, and how awful it was that in the new era, now the communism has been thrown off, that the market was flooded with Stephen King and Danielle Steele, and no one was really buying the works of Ivan Klima anymore. And, hey, Ivan Klima, isn't that terrible? And he and everyone else like him would look at them like they were crazy people and say, no, that is not terrible. The whole point is that that our work doesn't have to be political anymore. We can get on to other things, and there's something artificial and thankfully short-lived about going to every single play, looking for kind of hidden words and messages within the text and subtle winks from the players. But that's not the normal state of affairs, so we should not be nostalgic about
No, I mean, it's created a lot, that kind of oppression. We just took a little family vacation into St. Petersburg and the Baltics, and you're reminded in Shostakovich and other things how there was a lot of fascinating and powerful culture that was created out of oppression, and sometimes it was a way of communicating when people couldn't communicate openly in a political way. But that's not a case for oppression.
Of course. Let's switch to modern topics here, and maybe you can tee it off by talking a little bit about what you expect, hope, and fear for the national conversation with a capital NC having to do with jobs. Four-letter word of the American economy.
Right, the national conversation about jobs. I mean, I have to say, I am not mass. I mean, I'm glad to see a conversation. I mean, jobs is the economic issue. It's not in the short term. It's not deficit reduction. So, and I do believe, I already nodded to Keynes. I obviously government can play a role in bringing up aggregate demand and creating jobs. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We are so constrained, both constrained in our minds and actually realistically constrained in what we can do both politically and even economically, that I'm not particularly hopeful that any plan is going to have a huge impact on jobs. I should say, in terms of what government can do, I just saw a couple minutes ago a CBO report that the stimulus created somewhere between 1 million and 2.9 million jobs. So these things are real. As to what we can do at this point without anything like that level of spending on the table, the employer, the job credit for employers that they're talking about, it's a pretty small gesture, a lot less efficient than just, something like the make work pay credit that just actually puts money in people's pockets and reduces the cost of employment at a particular price, or extending the payroll tax cut further. I don't know if that's going to be part of the package. I mean, this is pretty small. This is pretty small beer. I think to the extent that it shows a government that's committed, that gets it, and is committed to thinking about employment and thinking about getting the economy out of either the doldrums or the second dip of the recession, I think it's an important gesture. I wouldn't want them to do anything else, but I don't, I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep in the details of these policies that are really going to be pretty marginal. No matter what.
I haven't seen the Congressional Budget Office report that you referenced, but I know that all the way up until now, whenever they have weighed in on the question of the stimulus, they did so using not actual measurements of what has happened in the field, but on models that were created before the stimulus came through. So it's I think a bit of a departure from reality, and that kind of gets to
let's reference here, and we'll put up a link to it. Dylan Matthews, who writes on Ezra Klein's site at the Post, and I believe is still in college and is a wonderful writer, did a great job analyzing 9 different studies of the stimulus last week, of which I think 4 used modeling and 5 used empirical evidence, and I think a couple of them, I think 3 of them found little or no effect from the stimulus, and they were, some of those were modeling and some of those were empirical. And he goes through it. There are pros and cons to both the modeling and the empirical approaches. The modeling approach actually is able to extract more clearly the stimulus itself, as opposed to all the other things that are going on at the same time. So it's not like it's clear cut that that's a bad approach. And Dylan's piece does a wonderful job of explaining the pros and cons of each approach.
That's good to hear, and we'll make sure that our Peter Suderman, who writes very intelligently about the CBO and did, I think, the best kind of feature analysis of the office itself in the height of the healthcare debate. I'm sure he will, or maybe already has, reacted to it.
Right.
But I would say this: there is a boy who cried wolf aspect to the question of jobs. I mean, we had a jobs package in 2010 that passed and was signed in by the president, and has been dutifully forgotten by absolutely everybody. You've had Nancy Pelosi.
You mean the stimulus or something else?
No, there was a jobs package that passed last June, I believe it was, in June 2010.
Which had the payroll tax. Payroll tax.
I mean, people remember the payroll tax, which is a pretty interesting side argument in its own. But for the most part, they forget that we were talking about jobs last summer as well, which was I don't know if it was the first or the second of our recovery summers. Nancy Pelosi has said over and over again, whether it's the healthcare reform, whether it's various cap and trade legislation, even discussing the Kyoto Treaty, or not the Kyoto, whatever the successor is, that it's all about jobs. It's about jobs, 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 and jobs. We heard a lot of discussion that weatherization efforts led by Joe Biden was going to create jobs. We've heard a lot of this talk, and the fact of it all is that after having done things in the name of jobs, both parties, both presidents, in the recent era, we are now staring face to face with fewer Americans at work, able-bodied Americans at work, than we've seen since 1983. So I think that there is a kind of skepticism built in towards claims of either that the existing policy has been good rather than bad, or has pushed the needle in the right direction, or that some new Washington idea about jobs is going to produce worthwhile results. And I think it speaks to something. There was a Gretchen Morgenstern, and I hope I'm not botching her name. She had a column, I think, yesterday in the New York Times, and she's got a very interesting looking book out that's pretty skeptical of bailout economics in general.
That's Reckless Endangerment with
yes,
Rosner, right?
Which I have not read.
I have. I actually kind of liked it. I enjoyed reading it. It's problematic in the degree to which it puts all the blame on Fannie Mae, or a disproportionate amount of blame on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were corrupt institutions, particularly Fannie Mae, but really weren't responsible for the bulk of the subprime lending and the bubble.
Well, I mean, the argument there, and I think it's worthwhile to have, and also to note that it remains with us, is just they are a recipient of moral hazard, and moral hazard can then influence all kinds of dodgy lending practices, and let's try to build derivatives on derivatives, knowing that there's going to be an ultimate backstop. And that to me is more pressing as an issue on some level than some kind of showy conference and discussion and whatever legislation about jobs. Is that we still have a mess of a housing situation, and the approach led by Henry Paulson to begin with, and certainly continued by Barack Obama, has been to kind of keep putting off reforms of Fannie and Freddie and just the government dominating the mortgage lending business, which it does not need to do ultimately. And I think there's an argument to be made that you can, we need to see housing prices find their floor, and we keep instead trying to delay and put off the pain or to ameliorate it. And I'm afraid that until that gets unwound, we're not really going to be talking about a real recovery in any sense, and then therefore jobs.
I think that's I basically agree with that, but I think part of housing prices finding their floor is also banks accepting their losses, which means millions of mortgages need to be renegotiated. The banks need to take those losses, which they're currently stretching out, and programs like HAMP are kind of letting them stretch them out. They keep people from an incredible number of HAMP, that's the Housing Assistance Program. I think more than half of those go right back into foreclosure. So they're just kind of stretching out an inevitable where they really do have to write down some mortgages and accept some losses and do something much more aggressive than what the 50s and get out of the mortgage fraud problem as well, and just write off some value. It can't all fall on consumers to have or homeowners to have that falling value. So I think there's two things to be done here. I don't have a strong coherent view about Fannie and Freddie as public or private. We're actually doing a conference on that on the 13th, so maybe I'll learn more from that. And Gretchen Morgensen's co-author Josh Rosner is one of the participants. So I'll learn something at that point. But clearly, I mean, nothing would unleash money into the economy more than getting people out of this burden. People who are way underwater on their mortgages, getting them out of some of that burden, or at least figuring out where they are economically. You've just got a lot of consumers who are really tied up. by this, which, in Washington, D.C., we don't feel that as much as people see and feel it in other parts of the country.
Absolutely not. In fact, there was a piece, I believe, again, in the New York Times recently that's been looking at studies of economic attitudes across the country, and it finds overwhelmingly that people who are the most optimistic about the economy are residents of Washington, D.C.,
right.
And it's not even close, and all the surrounding counties. It certainly is stunning living here, and where gentrification has not paused even for a nanosecond. And then go back to the real America, like Los Angeles, California, and see the for lease signs everywhere. It's a pretty jarring contrast, to be sure.
Yeah, it certainly has a huge effect on. It's hard for it not to have an effect on Woodbury. I mean, the economy that I see every day is just not the economy that Americans are seeing.
Let's switch gears and talk about Republican presidential politics. I don't know where you are in the kind of kibitzing section of what you see out there.
That's all I get to do is kibitz? I don't even get a vote?
Well, are you going to vote in the GOP primaries?
Well, I mean, there's always something to be said for, you live in D.C., you might as well vote in the GOP primaries.
Yeah, I just can't. I can't.
You'd have a huge impact on the number of delegates. My vote relative to, however many delegates come from D.C. would be much greater than.
It's like the most useless place in the world to vote, except I guess if there's a local initiative on the ballot or something like that. And you could argue pretty well that the last mayoral primary election, not the general, but the primary, certainly had some influence on education policy in the city. But just if you are like me, don't belong to a political party and want to vote, it is almost worse than useless to vote in Washington, D.C. And I say that as a very enthusiastic voter. Normally speaking, but let's hear what you see.
I'm still an enthusiast. I vote in every little thing that comes along.
It's fun,
and of course, I have a child in DC public schools, so obviously those things do matter to me. But folks like Rick Perry and Michelle Bachmann do not run in DC. It's been interesting to watch the rise of Perry. I actually want to start with one. I guess I want to pose a question to you.
Sure.
And before we go to the kind of the big picture of Republican presidential candidates, the Perrys and the Bachmans and the Romneys and so forth, I didn't realize until a few days ago that there is a candidate in the Republican primaries who was a two-term, very popular governor of a swing state, and is well below even Huntsman in the media attention polls, and that's Gary Johnson. And yeah. I'm just really interested, from a libertarian viewpoint. I mean, here's a guy who seems, he's actually reduced the size. I'm not, I don't get a vote, and I'm not sure I'd vote for him if I did. But, here's a guy who's actually cut government significantly rather than just basically not raising taxes, which is what Pawlenty did and Perry did. He was super popular. It's a significant state. I was trying to see what percentage of the Hispanic vote that he got in his re-elections, but in a state that's 40% Hispanic, he must have gotten a decent chunk of it to win with. I think he won his re-election with 55, 56% a few years ago. Why is there no interest in this candidate?
It's a very good question. I think partly because, and I say this as someone who is, if you put a gun to my head, he would probably be my first choice in the Republican Party. Although mostly I'm rooting for him and Ron Paul to be, in the final five or something. Part of it is that.
Well, then they'll cancel each other out.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you, I encourage you to watch or read the transcript of the South Carolina debate, which is the first Republican presidential debate. There was 5 candidates on stage, and Johnson and Paul were both among them. And I wrote an editor's note column about this a couple issues back. It was great to hear, first of all, that the discussion went for a good 10 minutes on whether we should legalize heroin, and just imagine how awesome that is, a topic at a Republican presidential debate. But also that their responses specifically to that question and the drug war writ large both reflected different and important and valuable strains within what we might call, if we're being pretentious about it, the libertarian big tent, which is to say, Gary Johnson had a very kind of pragmatic cost-benefit analysis type of answer that you would expect from a guy who was a governor of a state and working in the nitty-gritty of various bills. He said, we got 2.3 million people in prison. It's costing us X amount of dollars to warehouse 850,000 marijuana arrests a year, and so on and so forth. And Ron Paul's response, befitting his approach, which is more about philosophy and kind of first principles than it is about pragmatic governance, Ron Paul just said, what would you do if we legalized heroin tomorrow? Does that mean you would shoot up? Does it require government sanction to prevent you from a bad activity? And he actually jolted my brain, because I'm much more kind of pragmatically oriented. I try to have conversations usually about how the libertarian impulse can interface with the world as we live in and make it a better place, which is the spirit of our book in many ways. And so I tend to talk about legalizing marijuana because that's what's in front of us and possible, much more than wanting to bring up legalizing heroin, because that's what the haters always try to do to undermine your arguments. But Ron Paul's formulation was great and also welcomed to the debate. So,
I'm not sure I understand what. I mean, Ron Paul was. I'm not sure what his formulation was.
Well, his was that we don't need laws to. We don't need the. Why do we have to pass a law prohibiting every bad thing or every sort of abuse that we want out there on the principle
so Paul was in favor of legalizing heroin.
Yes.
Johnson was not.
I'm not sure that he actually took a position on heroin at the debate, and it's probably there in the transcript. I don't recall that he did, but it was more just that let's say that they're both in favor of legalizing marijuana, or decriminalizing it at a federal level, which they both are. Ron Paul's basic take on that is my body, my own. I have domain over my own things. Period. That's the philosophy. And Gary Johnson's would be more, hey, the drug war is a failure. It's cost us a lot of money, and so on and so forth. And both of those things are right. They're right in different ways, and they appeal to different audiences there. But to answer your question about why he isn't gaining traction, I would say a couple of things. One is that Ron Paul gets a lot of the existing oxygen in the room among people who prefer limited government, period, just because he's been around for a long time. He ran as a Libertarian Party presidential nominee in 1988. He came in fourth place last time, won many more delegates than Rudolph Giuliani, and then since then, his influence has only grown. 4 years ago, if someone was talking about the Federal Reserve, the typical answer, and I'm ashamed to say that I might have participated in this, was to sort of snicker. Look at them going on about the Federal Reserve. But actually, thanks to his tireless kind of advocacy in, at the very least, auditing the Federal Reserve, we now have things like important Freedom of Information Act requests kind of showing what the institution is doing. So he has a big audience. The other thing is that New Mexico is a small state. Johnson hasn't had a podium from which to talk about much of anything since 2003. He's only gotten into the game over the last year or so as he's been cycling into running for president.
He's sort of like Jerry Brown was when he ran for president in 1992. Except people vaguely remembered.
Except, Jerry Brown had been a credible national figure for a while before. Johnson has, he is notable for being the first major politician in this country to come out steadfastly against the war on drugs and for the legalization of marijuana, which he did in office, and he didn't suffer as a result. So he gets a lot of credit. I know him a little bit. I've talked to him a lot and like the guy on a personal level. He's putting all his chips on New Hampshire, basically, and hoping that the live free or die state is going to rally around him. And we'll see. It's been disappointing so far to see it. On the other hand, it has been, from my point of view, very rewarding to see Ron Paul do so well in preliminary kind of polling, and certainly in the Iowa straw poll, for whatever that's worth. And I think that he definitely is going to be a top 4 finisher, and he's definitely going to make some noise in both Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it seems to me like if you're a libertarian, you've got, the problem you have to overcome is people will say it all is interesting in theory, but you can't really govern that way. And then to actually be able to say, look, here's a guy who governed a pretty complicated state with a lot of poverty, a lot going on, not big, but about the size of Utah, really. So, he's got nothing on Huntsman, really, or Huntsman has nothing on him in terms of the size of the state, and Romney only served 1 term. So, he's got a lot to show. He's probably one of the few people who can say, look, it is possible to govern as a libertarian.
Yeah, and there's, I think, a new poll that his office at least was championing the other day or today, saying that he's above Huntsman in a key poll that is supposed to determine debate participants.
I think I saw a 2%, 1% in it, which I think what do you have to get for the, one of them said it at 2%, and I think it was considered almost like intended to allow Huntsman in, but he can't even make 2%.
Yeah, I think it's whatever it is, it's hovering around 2%, which is certainly disappointing, and hopefully that'll kick up. He's certainly gotten pretty good media attention, not in terms of overall attention, but when they has been written about, at the Atlantic, even at the National Review and Weekly Standard, it has been pretty positive because he's disarming with journalists. He has that kind of McCain 1999 way of, or even earlier McCain, of seeming to say things that should undermine his candidacy, and so of course every reporter worth his or her salt eats that up. Yeah.
Although I feel like I haven't seen that much of it, and I actually was under the impression that he was considering running for the Libertarian nomination, not that he was an active candidate for the Republican nomination.
Certainly not. And I would commend everyone. Just today we posted our latest Reason TV Q&A with him and Nick Gillespie. That was shot, I believe, a few weeks back.
Good. All right.
So what is your, aside from the Libertarian upstart wing, what is your assessment of the field and what that says about where Republicans are right now?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that, views that were pretty far out there are now totally within the are now very much all there is of the Republican Party. I thought Dave Weigel had an interesting piece in Slate today talking about how 5 years ago when there was a small faction that would propose that for to pay for aid to Katrina victims we should make cuts elsewhere in the budget, and it was instantly shot down by folks like Tom DeLay and Ted Stevens because we don't do that. Whereas now Cantor says the same. I mean that is now a mainstream Republican message. Just kind of one example of how far what used to be the center of the Republican Party has moved to the right, and certainly Perry embodies that. I feel like I'm not ready to join everybody makes straight line projections, and that's, so everybody's like, it's going to be Rick Perry. It's going to be Rick Perry. I think the guy's totally untested on the national stage. And I think, people who say, well, Perry might be considered extreme, but, Ronald Reagan was considered extreme in 1979, and he went on to beat Jimmy Carter. Obviously, that's true. But Ronald Reagan did have to do a lot to show that he was very much within the political mainstream, and he did so. And had he not been able to do that, I think we would have had a second term of Jimmy Carter, for all, which is actually hard to imagine. But it was a threshold that Reagan had to cross, and that Perry hasn't yet crossed. And so I think we don't. I don't know. He could easily blow up in a million different points along the way. He hasn't even participated in a debate yet. However, I've always been a huge skeptic of Mitt Romney. I mean, he still does incredibly poorly in polls, given the fact that his name recognition is far greater than anyone else's. And he's still, he tried to have a period where he didn't flip and flop and tie himself in knots, and now he's going to be right back. He's right back at that. So I have a hard time believing that it all is going to suddenly fall to Romney without a little more enthusiasm about Romney somewhere in the party. And the rest seems to be there for entertainment value.
Three points that your comments raised with me. One, regarding kind of the hurricane and disaster spending, the shifting the center of gravity, and even Tom DeLay. I was just looking, I forget what the occasion was, probably talking about disaster spending. In, I believe, 2004, Tom DeLay said of the federal government, look, we've cut all we can. We've cut to the bone. That's as far as we can go. Sorry. And I think it speaks to, what you would describe as being, more right-wing or right-of-center, for me, is an overdue correction of Republican economic policy, which is to say, during Bush's term, under mostly Republican dominance of Congress, they jacked up spending 60%, adjusted for inflation, which is horrendous from the point of view of those of us who believe that the government should live within its means and be limited in scope in both counts.
Well, government can live within its means if it's willing to embrace them. I mean, that the Republican crime was to not create the means.
Well, the Republican crime, in my point of view, is that they took Bill Clinton level of spending and then jacked it up. For me, tax cut and spend and tax and spend are both bad choices. It's the spending that I don't like. And the spending has just skyrocketed on every level, and I think we're going to be paying for that for a long time in various measures. And David Stockman, who's a really interesting character, and I would recommend reading a Q&A that we published with him about 8 months ago, I think, former Reagan budget director, who's now become a real big Austrian economics guy. He made the point, even when he was serving under Reagan, that tax cut and spend is even worse than tax and spend, because what you need to do is make people aware of how costly this thing is, and then it'll either impel you to start actually cutting so you can tax less or whatever. He thought it was more honest, which is an interesting argument. But going beyond that, talking about kind of Mitt Romney and Rick Perry, one thing we keep hitting on in the book and just in general, I would recommend everyone go to Real Clear Politics. They have .com. They have this standing feature of the presidential race 4 years ago today, basically, and it'll show you polls and the overwhelming thing from 2007 on the Republican side is that Rudolph Giuliani.
I know the Giuliani. Everybody had a straight line projection of Giuliani.
Yeah. So even I was looking up stats from. Not stats as much, but more commentary about Bill Clinton back at this time of the year in 1991, and everyone was waiting for a real candidate to show up. When's Mario Cuomo going to come in? And certainly very few people were talking about it like he had any chance, or he was any kind of serious candidate. So, I think in the punditry business, especially, people are kind of notoriously untethered to how limited their own view can be of things. That said, I agree with your kind of basic take on Romney. I liken him to the John Kerry of 2012 for the Republicans. Tall, erect, good-looking, if you're into that kind of thing, Massachusetts guys who are being offered as examples of what a base that doesn't like them think can possibly win an election against a president they hate.
Right.
I think it's a sustainable sentence right there. Really, because it's remarkable. The biggest kind of trend line in the GOP base, or all the level of enthusiasm right now, is in the basic kind of Tea Party-ish conception that we're spending too much money. That we have to stop spending so much money. That's really it. Obamacare is an overreach. The government is going too far, too fast. We've got to stop it. Love it or hate it, that is where all of the passion is. Right. And Romney is so not on that side of the argument, particularly as concerns Obamacare, which is patterned and has many things in common with Romney Care, and and to listen to him prevaricate and flip-flop on this kind of stuff. I think Peter Suderman had a great Twitter comment during the last presidential debate. I think this regarded Romney's approach towards Afghanistan, something like, Romney has been absolutely clear all along about his views on Afghanistan, he wants to be president. And I think you can apply that to about 1,000 different things, each one of which he's either prevaricating wildly or just has a position and view that is at odds with where all the enthusiasm is in the Republican base. So that just sets up a fascinating showdown. Like, is there going to be someone who is in line with the Republican base? Are Republicans going to freak out? And I think the answer is definitely yes, if Ron Paul gets anywhere close to this thing. And like, what kind of new alliances are going to come to try to block him, because he's going to be seen as dangerous crazy when it comes especially to foreign policy. So it's boiling down to be a pretty fascinating sort of battle for the soul of the modern Republican Party.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I mean, I have to say, I'm kind of soft on flip-flopping. I mean, I think politicians are meant to be responsive, and I don't think it's the end of the world if they take a position, because that's where they. I mean, I think that's what, in many ways, responsive democracy calls for that. And yet, I'm still continually shocked by Romney, and just he's not even able to give you, at least me, for one moment, a feeling of sincerity about anything he says. You know? I mean, I remember when he was, when he launched his presidential run, and said, they asked, why did you decide to run for president? He said, well, we were sitting around the table, and my wife said to me, Mitt, it's really important to have a businessman like you in the White House. I'm like, I don't even believe that conversation happened. It's completely ridiculous. People don't talk to each other that way.
Who knows?
Married people don't talk to each other that way. It's just everything is so contrived. It's just really hard to see that connection. But it will be a test, also, obviously, of whether there is such a thing as the Republican establishment that's able to exercise a veto on certain candidates, like Paul, or actually anoint a candidate. And maybe that at this point, the establishment, which not too long ago was pretty much able to anoint a candidate. I mean, they were able to say, George W. Bush is our guy. And to some extent, even in 2008, where it may be that they have the veto power, but not the power to anoint, so that even if they don't like Rick Perry, or a big faction of the establishment, isn't thrilled with Rick Perry, that they may only be able to veto Paul and maybe Bachmann, but not actually anoint their own favorite. And I guess all the people they wanted to get into the race, the Paul Ryan and whoever else was being mentioned, Chris
Christie sometimes,
aren't happening.
Yeah, Ryan certainly isn't. I don't know if Christie has decisively ruled it out. But
I think he's too busy going to Washington begging for federal money today.
Mitch Daniels obviously got out early, although he was not endearing himself to the base, regrettably, because I think he is a more interesting candidate from my point of view than certainly any of the other non-libertarians who are running for Republican Party. It is interesting that kind of anointing power is over, which it is, I think. The 2008, which is an unholy mess of a primary season, was probably the most tumultuous Republican nominating process in many decades, probably since World War II. Just in terms of usually things had boiled down to being between just two candidates, and it was pretty clear what side the establishment was on. And this time, all the money held back. Now the money is being held back even more. I mean, I'm sure what's basically going through the minds of the establishment is, can someone like Rick Perry catch enough fire that we can be fine with him? He seems washable and presentable in a way that probably Michelle Bachmann does not, even though a lot of people might be paying lip service to her right now.
Right.
I don't think that in their heart of hearts Republicans believe that Michelle Bachmann is electable, and for a variety of reasons. And then the question is, it's going to be between like a Perry figure, if not Perry himself, Romney and a Ron Paul, and that's just what is the decision-making matrix if you are a Republican establishmentarian with that, and that's just a pretty fascinating divide right there.
Right. And a lot of that, I think, a lot of that has to do with there's clearly a Republican establishment that would say Rick Perry's fine, and a part of the Republican establishment that, for all kinds of Texas Rove-related reasons, just has issues with him. And I don't fully know what those are, or whether they're reconcilable.
Well, like
for years, I thought I believed going into 2008, the establishment really can't accept McCain because of the giant Karl Rove, John Weaver meltdown, blah blah blah. And then they're like, we're fine, we're fine with this. Somehow there's an ability to overcome those what seemed like big objections.
Yeah, except that it was. You could tell that there's a difference between, support and enthusiasm, and McCain had neither enthusiasm from the establishment, who, could not ever forget that he ran against them explicitly in 2000, and was still talking that way through 2004 and 5. And then also, as importantly, the base, grassroots. McCain has been as distant from the base of the Republican Party as just about any prominent national politician you could name. And so there wasn't. I think that he probably narrowed the gap considerably with Barack Obama by nominating Sarah Palin. Regardless of what you think about Sarah Palin, she totally ignited the base in a way that McCain never was going to, which is bizarre.
Right. Although it's also bizarre to think that you could win the nomination without igniting the base, and that's always been, I remember, a long time before the 2008 election, I think it was my friend Rick Perlstein said, it's going to be McCain because the Republican Party always nominates the person who's just next, who's just established as the next guy, whether it's Dole or Bush or McCain. And for all the ups and downs and the points where McCain seemed totally dead, in the end he was next. He got the nomination.
I think Perlstein was right, but for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily because they fell in behind him. In fact, going to your point about how McCain won, it is a bizarre and nonetheless true fact that the early primaries and caucuses on which McCain faced his winning, so New Hampshire, Florida, etc., he won a few of these, obviously, but in none of these, not a single one, did people who described themselves as Republican, regardless of what they were registered for in the purposes of that vote, none of them did McCain win even a plurality among self-described Republicans.
Right.
He's a guy who won the nomination by getting self-described independents, Democrats,
or actual independents in the case of New Hampshire.
Actual independents case, or people who just cross-registered, and also by getting the anti-war votes. He overwhelmingly got the anti-war vote in New Hampshire as opposed to Ron Paul. Ron Paul did not run a very good campaign in New Hampshire, but still, my God, really? And that's a curiosity. I think that's never happened before, and I think it's probably likely to never happen again, unless, again, Ron Paul gets into the mix, because he has an incredible independent following out there. So, here's a little factoid for you, or factlet, to use it correctly, of people who voted for Ron Paul in the primaries in caucuses in the 2008 election. Only 38% of them ended up voting for John McCain. 38%. Yeah, crazy. So he has an ability to ignite a groundswell out there that I wouldn't discount.
Which is to say, they didn't vote. They voted for Obama. Do we know what they did?
Actually need to look at those numbers. I've just been trotting out the top line number, but I presume that. He got hundreds of thousands of write-in votes, so there's a lot who just voted directly for him. And I also presume that a bunch of them did not vote, and maybe a few voted for Bob Barr, but who was a Libertarian Party nominee, but that enthusiasm didn't seem to transfer. And again, getting back to the Gary Johnson conversation, there is the misnomer in the overall Libertarian political universe that Ron Paul fans are portable, and they're not. They adhere very strongly to him. I mean, there's even a huge group or a loud group within Ron Paul universe who are were super skeptical. They've since changed their tune about Rand Paul. That Rand Paul is he's been seen with neocons and he's getting ready to sell everyone down the river. It is a pretty loyal group of people, and they're not likely to say, okay, well, enough of that, we're going to go to Gary Johnson. It's really,
I don't know, there may be a term for something like that. I don't want to throw out, loaded words, but, L. Ron Hubbard, things like that come to mind.
Part of the phenomenon is that he is appealing to an ideal. He's appealing to a philosophy, and that is much more, on some level, idealistic than appeals to pragmatism. Period. And so it feels better to do it. And it's kind of, it doesn't matter what you think about his personality, but the whole mental approach and philosophical approach in that universe of libertarianism is much more philosophically oriented, and so that in itself is as appealing, if not more, than the man standing at the center of it.
I know we want to wrap up soon. I just want to raise one other thought that's come to my mind in watching the Republican presidential primary, which is to wonder whether the Republican Party actually wants to win this thing. And I say that, there was an Onion article the other day that said, that had the Mitch McConnell and others say, our highest goal is to get Obama reelected so we can continue to torment and torture him, because that's how we that's the thing that we most enjoy in life. And there was I think there's a certain element of truth to that. I think there was a period for Democrats in the Reagan administration, in the Reagan era, and even into the first Bush administration, where there was almost like an indifference to winning the presidency, because you had this attitude: we control Congress, we'll always control Congress, we'll be able to force the president to do certain things and sign certain things, and that's fine. And particularly for congressional leaders, they had a lot more power than they would have had with a president of the same party, and that's generally true. I almost feel like there's a similar dynamic here, that there's a if all the power were, yes, you'd have a lot more power in theory if you controlled all three branches of government, but you'd also you'd also bear all the responsibility and the things that, anything that people didn't like, they'd come at you with, so that the ability to actually control Congress and force the great, endlessly bipartisan Obama to kind of bend to your will occasionally might be of more value than actually winning the White House.
I'm going to see that very interesting sort of conspiratorial suggestion and raise
it good
by saying I think it's probably in the perceived interests of a lot of professional Republicans on Capitol Hill, Mitch McConnell among them, John Boehner, even John McCain, to kind of let the Tea Party enthusiasm stick its neck out and fail. Because ultimately they resent having to be responsive to constituent concerns and having to do things like support earmark bans, which McConnell and Boehner were totally against. And so they think, let's let this crazy virus run out and get the shellacking that it deserves, so we can once again have a more David Frum approved Republican Party of grown-ups. So there might be some of that at play too.
Although you can't go so far that you actually lose a lot of ground in Congress.
Yes, and so far the wind keeps blowing in that direction. Although it's way premature to talk about what it's going to look like come 2012. With that, I think we need to wrap up. Always great to talk to you, Matt.
Good to talk to you, Matt, and good luck with the book and your next issue of the magazine.
Thanks very much.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.